Welcome to Unified Conferencing. You are the first person to join the conference. The conference is being recorded. Conference recording has started. The conference recording has ended. Welcome to Unified Conferencing. You are the first person to join the conference. The conference is being recorded. Recording has started.
Thank you for having us on. I think we can make a start now. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. We realize that it's a Friday, and it's a Friday before a long weekend. So really, thank you very much for coming. This is a seminar sponsored by Secure Nutrition, which is a knowledge platform. It's an initiative that tries to bring together food security issues with agriculture and nutrition within the bank, within the World Bank, but also, more importantly, with other organizations and partners. And I'm sure probably your organizations are part of this Secure Nutrition. My name is Jose Cuesta. I'm a senior economist at the Poverty Reduction and Equity Unit here at the World Bank, and also member of the Secure Nutrition platform. We are very fortunate today to have Dr. Haan with us, presenting the update and review version of the IPC. I don't think that for those working on food security, we need to really introduce much the IPC. He will be talking about that. But I want to confess that I'm definitely a fan of the IPC, and I would like to see more IPCs in more countries. So hopefully this is a start of expanding the IPC to other places. I'm not sure whether the IPC already achieved what it was set to do, which I remember reading it was the common currency of food security and humanitarian research. Hopefully it's on its way to do that. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Haan. Please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nicholas Haan, and I work with the FAO as a consultant, as a senior technical advisor for the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification Project. And I'm going to be with you this afternoon to explain to you more about this IPC, what it is, how it works, and some of our future initiatives. And in particular, one of our future initiatives is to focus more on chronic food insecurity, classifying chronic food insecurity, and looking to get more people who haven't been a part of the IPC development to date, to get them now involved in the chronic side of things. As I mention this, I want to call out one of my colleagues from one of our partner agencies, and also someone who was very much involved in the development of this IPC, and that's Chris Hilberner from FuseNet. Hello, Chris. I know he works just down the block from here, and even though FAO is in Rome and FuseNet is here, we've been working extremely closely on the development of the IPC. So first off, I should note that you'll see all those logos at the bottom. The IPC is a global partnership. It's a partnership which actually has just recently expanded, and the current global partners are ACF, CARE, the West African regional body SILS, FAO, FuseNet, the Global Food Security Cluster, the European Union Joint Research Center, Oxfam, Save the Children, and the World Food Program. It's a pretty big list. It's an interesting list because this is a group of people, group of organizations which have gotten together and said, in as much as we're doing food security analysis and we all share the same goal of ending hunger, we recognize that we need a common system for classifying the nature and severity of food insecurity. So they got together and have worked to develop a system which they can all agree to classify food insecurity. I'm going to start off with 5 broad assertions if we are to actually end food insecurity. And I can't stress enough what a different perspective it is when you start to think, rather than doing programs, you actually think about ending hunger, ending food insecurity. And when you put that lens on, a number of things become crystal clear, or parameters which become sort of non-negotiable or obvious that you have to deal with and reconcile with if you are actually to end food insecurity. Number 1, multiple stakeholders must work together. Therefore, we need a common means for classifying food insecurity. This seems obvious. It seems obvious, but in fact, we oftentimes do not work together. We have the United Nations agencies splintered, looking oftentimes in silos at their own perspective on food insecurity. We have the NGO community, international and local NGOs, oftentimes splintered. We have the donor community, we have national governments and others. If we're actually to end food insecurity, we all have to work together and bring our comparative advantage to the table to solve it. Because we do have comparative advantages, and that's okay. That's actually a good thing. But if we're to make the most use of those comparative advantages, we need a common means for describing the nature and severity of food insecurity. And funny enough, inasmuch as we do have the broad definition from the World Food Summit of what food insecurity is, there's a lot of room in there for different interpretations and different classifications of what constitutes severe or not. So this effort in the IPC is to bring us together such that we actually do have a common means. Number 2, this seems obvious, but in fact we oftentimes forget national governments need to play a leading role. They're the frontline organization, have the frontline responsibility to end hunger for people in their sovereign states. The international community and other actors should be seen supporting that and building up capacity for those national governments to play that role that they should be playing. Number 3, food insecurity is by definition an incredibly complex phenomenon. You can list an almost infinite set of indicators that play into whether or not a household or an individual is going to be food secure. Crop production, market prices, satellite imagery, nutrition, soil, you name it. I could list, and probably if we did a little brainstorm here, we'd be here well into the weekend, still listing indicators that play into whether or not someone is food secure. Decision makers, however, need that complexity simplified to be able to take action. It's not enough to provide splintered insights about what's going on in a particular place. There should be a core set of information that decision makers can always expect to see presented to them in the same accessible manner each time, answering the same core questions. So there's an element of simplifying complexity, which is a difficult task. 4, this is obvious. Food insecurity requires strategic thinking and a strategic response. And as much as it's obvious, we don't tend to do it. It's pretty incredible. We tend to approach food insecurity with the solution that we have. If I have a hammer, I'm looking for a nail. Rather, we should, if we're going to end food insecurity, we should identify where it exists and then think through, for that particular locality, what is the most strategic response? And how to design that in a nuanced way to end food insecurity in that particular place. It's something that, again, seems obvious, but we oftentimes don't take the time to pause and think about how we should be doing something rather than having this notion of one size fits all. Lastly, we need professional standards. Interestingly enough, I don't think any one of you would allow an electrician to go into your house and mess with your wires, or a plumber to go into your house and mess with your pipes, if you didn't have some sense that that person had a certification or standard. You'd want to know. You wouldn't go on Craigslist or Angie's List or whoever's list and hire somebody if they didn't have a professional standard. Almost tragically, we in the food security community are making decisions on millions and millions, billions of people's lives, and millions, billions of dollars with no professional standards. It's pretty incredible that we've gotten this far. We need them. And we're ushering in a whole new era. I think you all get that sense of accountability and increased professional standards for not just humanitarian work, but for development work in general. And the IPC helps play into that. What is the IPC? It's two things. Number one, it's a set of tools and procedures, protocols, for classifying the nature and severity of food insecurity situations. Number two, it's a process for helping to build, for multiple stakeholders to share information and build technical consensus. So the IPC is both of these. And of those 5 assertions that you saw me identify at the beginning, you can see now already how the IPC is helping to address. It's not a panacea. It's helping to address many of those 5 assertions that I pointed out. The IPC is organized around 4 core functions. And for each one of these 4 core functions, we have a set of tools and procedures to enable analysts to do these 4 functions. Number 1, build technical consensus. So building technical consensus is very important for the IPC. Number 2, classifying severity and causes. 3 is communicating for action. And 4 is quality assurance. Communicating for action is oftentimes ignored or overlooked from the analyst perspective. They somehow think if they just provide thicker and thicker reports and more information, decision makers are going to make better and better decisions. That's just not the case. Rather, simplifying complexity, making it accessible and meaningful for decision makers is a real challenge and real goal. And that last one, quality assurance, is very important because, as you're going to see in the presentation, the IPC uses a convergence of evidence approach. It's not a modeling-based approach. It's a convergence of evidence approach that involves multiple stakeholders thinking and working together. Therefore, there needs to be a number of checks and balances, quality assurance mechanisms to make sure the product that comes out is actually a reliable one for decision support. This is a diagram that very simply shows what we call the analysis response continuum. And this broadly breaks up stages between situation analysis, response planning, response implementation, and that feedback loop that's always going on, monitoring, evaluation. These stages are identified on this diagram because each one of those stages, albeit there's overlap, but each one of those stages generally involves a discrete group of people, a discrete group set of skills, a discrete set of rules and guidelines. The IPC focuses on situation analysis. So in this large body of actions that must happen in order to have successful programming, the IPC just focuses on situation analysis. Excuse me. Situation analysis answers questions of how severe is it? Where is that going on? Who are the people? How many are the people? And what are the basic causes? And when? Those core questions of situation analysis are questions, and we've distilled it down to this core set of questions that will need to be answered in any situation of food insecurity, anywhere in the world, at any time, in any context. You will need to answer those questions. Where is it? Who are they? How severe is it? How many? When? And why? So the IPC focuses on that. And that set of questions is a set of questions that we as multiple stakeholders can work together to answer in ideally a technically neutral manner. Once you enter into the realm of response analysis, in as much as we'd like to think that would be a technically neutral process, the fact is you're now into the realm of agencies with huge interests about a certain type of response. Governments maybe with huge interests in a certain type of response. So the challenges for ensuring that that process remains technically neutral become greater. The situation analysis, theoretically, if I measure the temperature of water and I find it to be 98 degrees, we should all be able to agree that that actually is 98 degrees. Rather than whether I like it to be 98 degrees is a different story. We should be able to agree on the situation. These other stages, so the IPC focuses on situation analysis. These other stages obviously are equally important, and we strongly advocate for systematizing these other stages as well. There's a lot of work going on right now over the last, in fact, year and a half. And currently, I think it's picking up momentum and steam, and that is to better systematize response analysis, which asks the questions of, given the situation, what's the best response that can be implemented with regards to the technical side of things, plus operational issues, logistical issues, security issues, cost-benefit analysis, and other aspects. But that's a whole challenge in and of itself. So my main point here is the IPC focuses on situation analysis. We've developed a IPC analytical framework. I haven't mentioned, but I should mention that we have just recently developed and are launching next week IPC version 2. So IPC originally came from work that we were doing in Somalia, the FAO Managed Food Security Analysis Unit for Somalia, back in 2004. And it has evolved since then. It was never designed, interestingly, to be a global standard. It was designed to meet the needs of the work that we were doing at that particular time, and then evolved into this global standard. IPC version 1.1, we were asked and challenged, well, where's your conceptual framework? And we said, well, we have 4. We have 4 conceptual frameworks, and they're frameworks that you should be largely familiar with. The Risk Hazard Vulnerability Framework, the Sustainable Livelihoods Approach, the UNICEF Conceptual Model for Malnutrition, and the FAO 4 Pillars of Food Insecurity, that's availability, access, utilization, and stability. So the challenge that was posed to us, people, and Chris was one of them, and there's other folks working on developing IPC version 2.0, was how to integrate those conceptual frameworks into a single IPC analytical framework. And this is the result of that. And this addresses head-on a number of conceptual ambiguities that have been floating amongst us analysts for many years without real clarity. Meaning, if one of our colleagues is using the word availability, and another colleague is using the word availability, do they really mean the same thing? Oftentimes, no. If one colleague is mentioning the word utilization, and another one's mentioning the word utilization, do they really mean the same thing? No. It's actually a very rich discussion about how different interpretations of these terms, and we could spend hours here talking about this. But just to say that we have this analytical approach that makes clarity on a number of issues, and I want to just point out a couple things. Number one, you'll see on the right-hand side, we've grouped a set of elements that we call food security outcomes. And the IPC classification is oriented or referenced against these food security outcomes, and there are 4. We've distilled these outcomes after great thought and whatnot down to 4. Food consumption, livelihood change, nutrition, and mortality. And the idea here is these 4 outcomes are generally comparable, irrespective of where on earth this is happening, what the drivers are, what the causes are, what the ethnicity is, what the political situation is, and whatnot. The 4 outcomes are generally comparable. When we see a GAM rate, a global acute malnutrition rate of X, it's generally comparable to a GAM rate somewhere else in the world. When we see mortality rates of Y, it's generally comparable elsewhere. Same thing for food consumption and livelihood change. What are not comparable are this whole set of what we call contributing factors. Contributing factors lead into these outcomes, and contributing factors include things like the hazards that might have happened. They include people's baseline vulnerability, market prices, crop production, livestock conditions, and whatnot. There's a whole set of contributing factors, but these factors are not comparable from one place to the next. They have to be understood in their context, in their livelihood context, in their social context, in their historical context, etc., etc. So market prices, an indicator people get very, very, very excited about, because this is in fact, we're entering a whole nother, unfortunately, a whole nother cycle perhaps of very high market prices. Market prices, a skyrocketing market price in one place can be really good for people if you're producing that commodity. It's devastating for the people who are purchasing it. Seems obvious. So even something like market prices lead into our outcomes. So if we're to make sense of market prices, we have to think about the implication of that on outcomes. Another key issue here is the relationship between nutrition. I know Secure Nutrition is hosting this. The relationship between nutrition and food security. This is saying that they're not one and the same thing. That nutrition and food security are not one and the same thing. Rather, nutrition, as per this analytical framework, is nutritious food is an inherent part of food consumption. Because when we speak of food consumption, we speak of caloric quantity and nutritious quality of the food, micronutrients and whatnot. Nutrition outcomes, however, global acute malnutrition, stunting, and whatnot, can have other drivers that explain them other than food-based drivers. That's exactly consistent with the nutrition conceptual model from UNICEF. So nutrition outcomes can have other, what we call non-food security specific contributing factors, other factors that are explaining them than a food-based issue. And this is really important because in the humanitarian community at least, oftentimes when we see a high malnutrition rates, we jump to the conclusion that this must be food. And therefore, when you see a $500 million cap appeal, you look at many of those cap appeals, food is largely a big part of that. The question is, have people really thought through whether or not food is a limiting factor there, or is it health and hygiene or water? So this model helps us tease those relationships out.
Just one clarification. Here you have primary and secondary outcomes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a question on the relationship between primary and secondary outcomes. So of the set of outcomes, we further made a distinction between primary food security outcomes and secondary food security outcomes. And the idea being here is, if you are food insecure, you have to go through one of the two primary outcomes. That has to be manifest in food consumption and or a livelihood change. After going through one of those two pathways, then the secondary outcomes should become manifest, and that is malnutrition and mortality. And the idea here is that many households, when faced with a crisis, will forego their assets to maintain their consumption levels. Other households might forego their consumption levels to maintain their assets. Did I say that right? So it can work both ways. Households can forego their assets to maintain their consumption, or forego their consumption to maintain their assets. Either way, as far as this model is concerned, you're food insecure. You have to go through one of those two pathways, of food consumption or livelihood change. And then as a secondary result, that should be manifest in malnutrition rates and or increased mortality. Okay, so this is the way the IPC works is it works on two concepts here. Number one, the IPC, this is the yellow box down at the bottom, is based on the body of evidence, the whole body of evidence that you have here, but with specific reference to outcome thresholds that are based on international standards. So what we've done is we've drawn together international standards of these outcomes of food consumption, livelihood change, nutrition, and mortality, put them all together in the same reference table, and calibrated them all to the same reference table such that when we see a certain measure of food consumption, livelihood change, nutrition, or mortality, that references a certain phase. But the actual classification is based on the body of evidence, triangulation of information. So, based on that analytical framework, I know you cannot read this, apologies, there's just too much information here. Based on that analytical framework, we've developed these reference tables. But you can see the broad structure of the reference tables. Number one, the IPC divides acute food insecurity into 5 phases. And the 5 phases are phase 1 is none or minimal acute food insecurity, 2 is stress, 3 is crisis, 4 is emergency, 5 is famine or catastrophe. And the idea is that those 5 phases have not been defined based on data needs. Rather, they're defined based on decision makers' needs, based on implications for response. Each of those 5 phases have generally distinct implications with regards to urgency and strategy. The most interesting distinction is the distinction between phase 3 and phase 4. That's the one that we oftentimes get wrong. Phase 3, according to IPC terms, we call that crisis. The implication for response here is that we should be investing in building up livelihoods while making sure that people have enough food, but the primary emphasis is on building livelihoods. Phase 4, the primary objective is actually to save lives and livelihoods. Things like general food distribution or general cash distribution, getting resources in people's hands becomes more important than actually building the livelihood itself, because the situation is so severe and so tenuous that people are on the brink of death. So that distinction becomes very important, and the way the IPC is structured is to tease that distinction out. And then you get to situations of famine, which I guess it gets obvious there in terms of the extreme urgency and extreme comprehensive needs for action. So we have a reference table for classifying areas. We also have a reference table for classifying household groups. So the way the IPC works is you can classify a whole area as one particular phase, and you can further break that down and classify groups of households within there, which is important for strategic response designed to the needs of unique groups of households. And I should point out, we've taken the common measurements of common methodologies for directly measuring food insecurity. We've grabbed them and calibrated them all to the same system. So in here, if you had really like Superman eyes, you could read it, but I know you can't. You will see things like the Household Dietary Diversity Score. And we've calibrated that all to the same phases. Something called the Household Economy Approach, something called the Coping Strategies Index, the Food Consumption Score, which is what WFP uses, and the Household Hunger Score. These are commonly used methodologies that want survey type things that people can go out and use, and now they're all calibrated to the same system. Once you have your data and indicators, the IPC uses, the analytical approach of the IPC is meta-analysis, meaning you're pulling together existing information and looking at the meta broad pattern, and 2, it uses a convergence of evidence approach. It does not use a modeling-based approach. If modeling-based approaches were possible, we probably would use them. But in fact, food security is just proven to be too complex for that. And furthermore, not only is food security proven to be too complex, but the data availability and consistency of that data from one place to the next and in time for decision making has proven not to exist. It's not to say we might get there in the future, but right now the state of affairs is we are not able to model in a consistent, comprehensive, and reliable way what the food security situation is. So the IPC rather uses the good old-fashioned human brain. Critical thinking. Critical thinking. Bring our evidence together, have our common reference table, put your evidence on the table, and think through what that evidence is telling you and how it's converging on a particular phase. And you work on that as a group of technical experts. What you get at the end of the day is or end of the day or end of the week, if it took you a week long to do it, is a map that classifies subnationally what the food security situation is in various areas which are now comparable. This seems kind of obvious. You may be saying, well, why didn't we have this before? We didn't have this before. We did not have a comparable means of classifying a consistent way over time and over space the food security situations, whereas now, like this map, which is coming from last year, July 2011, because the analysts doing this were all using the same reference table, all using the same standards of the burden of evidence, convergence of evidence approach, they're able to classify areas at a subnational level which in fact are comparable. So if you see an area in northwest South Sudan, which is phase 4, humanitarian emergency, and you see another area in Kenya, which is phase 4 emergency, these are generally comparable with regards to outcomes. They're not saying that the contributing factors are the same. In fact, they'll be wildly different. Yes?
Sorry, I just wanted to ask a trick-related question for clarification. I understand that what you're saying is phase 4 here and phase 4 there are the same. How do we know when we're looking at a map like this that the spatial resolution of your data are comparable? From one country to the next or within a particular region, province and a country, or province?
You don't. Because in fact, the evidence that goes into this, because we do not have harmonized data sets, all using the same spatial resolution and the same methodologies, that's the state of affairs right now. Since we don't have that, the way the IPC is use what you do have, and at the end of the day, say for whatever area you delineate, this is the phase. Knowing that, in fact, your data sets will have been different going into it, your drivers will have been different, your livelihood context will have been different, but your outcomes are generally comparable with regards to severity. The other point which you might be getting at is the way the IPC acute classification system works is your unit of analysis is entirely flexible, spatially flexible. It can be as small as you want, theoretically, although we haven't seen this. It could be an actual village in and of itself. Or it could be as large as you want. We don't recommend this, but it could be a whole province for a country.
The only thing the reason I ask is that, and we know this isn't true in the foreign countries, have the map up there, that you could see something where you see, okay, all of Somalia looks red, that only parts of Ethiopia look red, but really it's because the spatial resolution is poorer in Somalia than Ethiopia. And I know that's not true on this map, but I'm just using that as a visual example if that's what could happen, and so it could make you think the problem is more severe.
You're absolutely right, because the analysts who are doing it, because we don't lock, this is a good observation, we're not predetermining what that spatial unit of analysis is going to be, and your observation is right. If one group of analysts make that a large unit of analysis, then that could have a different implication from another group that does a small, except we've set standards for that. And we have very clear standards for the percentage of households within the area, however small or however large. The percentage of households in the area that have to be exhibiting certain conditions has to be the same. So with that standard in place, it's saying, yeah, if you pick a large area of analysis, you're still beholden to the same percentage thresholds of households that have to exhibit a condition. Okay, so here, this enables, my main point here is following that same reference table, following the same standards, we can generate comparable analysis so that decision makers at a regional or global level are now able to allocate resources across countries, and also decision makers at the national level can allocate resources within the country. And not only just allocate resources, but think through the type of strategic response that's required. Because as I said, places that are phase 3 require a different type of response than phase 4. As obvious as that may seem, we, the community, make mistake after mistake after mistake of applying the wrong solution to a situation of a certain severity. Another question over here.
Excuse me, can you use please the microphone and say your name as well, organization?
Sorry, it's because we're live streaming.
Yeah.
So that everyone knows.
Peter Hybers, a Jefferson Fellow at the State Department. Just to follow on from the previous question, is there some indication given of the confidence in the assessment? Because obviously the underlying data and the degree to which this is extrapolated from sparse points is going to have a big implication, and which also would then be important to be able to make these comparable in some way. Absolutely.
Good observation, and the answer is yes. Now we're getting into we're lifting up the hood a little bit. For the way we have very clear standards, and when the analysts do their work, they have to document their evidence, and for each single piece of evidence that they use, they have to give it a reliability score, number one. And as difficult as that is, however, because the IPC welcomes quantitative and qualitative evidence, we have a guidance for people to give a reliability score of somewhat reliable, reliable, or very reliable. And we have a set of guidance to go along with that. After you've done your classification, and this is a very important point, after you've done your classification, the analyst in a given area will look at the body of evidence they use to classify, evaluate the reliability of the piece of evidence that they used, and then assign an overall confidence level. And we have 3 confidence levels. So for each area that gets classified, there's a confidence level of acceptable, medium, or high confidence. And just to give you a sense, and furthermore, we've identified a minimum bar, minimum threshold for acceptable confidence. And if you don't meet that minimum threshold, you don't get to classify. You actually leave that area gray on our map to convey we didn't have enough data. So just to let you know what that minimum is, you have to have, if you think back to our analytical framework, in order to classify, you have to have one piece of reliable evidence from any one of the outcomes, plus 4 more pieces of corroborating evidence, reliable evidence from any of the contributing factors. And if you have that, now you have a minimum acceptable confidence. If you don't meet that threshold, you don't classify. You make it gray. Which actually is important as well. We've had the situation in the DRC where the analyst said, look, we just don't have enough information to classify. Shaded it gray. And what did that do? That had the immediate effect. Decision makers were saying, well, we need to know what's going on there. What'd they do? They invested in data collection, which is what we should be doing. When we don't have enough information in an area, we need to make these investments. So the non-classification can be also very important for decision making as well. The important thing that we wanted to do with this version 2 is to make that just exactly your point. That issue of reliability and confidence, we made it stronger, and we wanted to set a minimum bar of confidence such that when someone sees an IPC map, they should have some sense that they can trust it for decision support. Okay, so yes.
What data are you collecting on the ground? This surveys or rainfall, or what exactly does the data look like?
It can be any of a very long list. So it might be, and if you look back at our contributing factors, I could just run through some examples here. Everything, first of all, baseline understanding of livelihoods is very important. And what makes people vulnerable? And we break that down into livelihood strategies, income sources, food sources, expenditure patterns. We also use this concept of livelihood assets. Livelihood assets are your 5 capitals. I don't know if in the bank you use that terminology much, but human capital, social capital, financial capital, natural capital, and physical capital. So that might mean education levels. It might mean soil fertility rates. It might mean deforestation rates, fishing water productivity and whatnot. Then on this box, it could be any of the hazards that people might have experienced: flood, drought, tsunami, price shock, political insecurity, disease. So depending upon the hazard at play, you would collect data on that. Then here, on availability, this includes things like production, food reserves, markets, and the like. On access, we break that down into 3 aspects of access. Financial access, so obviously market prices, wage labor rates and things like that become very important. Social access and physical access. Utilization, or food preferences, food preparation, water, and the like. So that data might be surveys, and then furthermore, all the outcomes also might be surveys. For food consumption might be one of like a household dietary diversity score. Livelihood change might be a survey on the degree to which people are selling off productive assets. Nutrition is obviously MUAC or GAM and the like. So it could be surveys, quantitative data. It could also be qualitative data, focus group interviews and whatnot. The way we set up the IPC is that it's an open system. It doesn't predetermine what that data is going to be. It just says you need to speak to these elements. And it's potentially a very, very long list. And if you look at each different country, they will use different data in different places. And it gets at her question, at the end of the day, what's comparable is the classification, not the contributing factors that went into it. Yes, I do.
Given the variety of the data you use and the nature of the situations you're working in, how long does it usually take to produce an IPC map that is based on convergence of evidence, multi-stakeholder agreement, and national ownership?
Mm-hmm. So how long does it take? We have to assume that you've already done the front-loaded effort of forming what we call a technical working group, a group of people who do this, and they have the capacity to do it. And those people should be people who are led by the government, but participation from the UN, from NGOs, from technical agencies like FuseNet, and others. So as soon as you've put that technical working group in place. Secondly, that you've actually done your data collection. So some sort of data collection exercise has to happen to feed into this. Now, once that's done, the question is, how long does the actual classification process take? It can take anywhere from an afternoon to a week, depending upon if you're just analyzing a particular locality or if you're doing full-on national analysis for all of Kenya or all of Uganda. And that can take a week of multiple people, maybe upwards to 80, 100 people involved in the analysis. Okay, okay.
My question is regarding the reliability and validity of the data that you collect. Do you also control for that to create the IPC?
Well, we do in that, as I mentioned, each piece of data, each piece of evidence gets a reliability score. It's a heuristic reliability score, I have to say, though. We provide general descriptions for each of 3 levels of reliability: somewhat reliable, reliable, and very reliable. If you don't meet the somewhat reliable criteria, that data can't even, we refuse it to even be considered into the analysis. And furthermore, our confidence levels, when we identify confidence levels, it's only based on reliable data. And our broad definition of reliable data is any data that's been collected using a scientific method. And yes, I know that open. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's because in an ideal world, we would be using statistically valid data and be able to measure our P-scores of every single piece of data. That's an ideal theorized world. In the real world, decision makers are having to make decisions based on partial data and data of varying degrees of reliability. Because the reality is we do not have consistent data sets of statistically valid data everywhere at all times. That's the constraint that we have to work in. As much as we'd like to change that, that's what we're working with. So the IPC is a system to make the best use of what we do have, be transparent about the reliability and evidence that we used, and come up with a conclusion that's actionable for decision makers. That's that nuance of what we've done with the IPC. Because so many people have gone down, I've been down these paths myself, of thinking if we just use my method, you only have to collect this data, and I can impose this everywhere around the world. The reality is you will not have that data everywhere, and you won't have it in time. Okay, so I mentioned we have our reference tables, and I'm talking about our analytical approach uses meta-analysis and convergence of evidence, and being explicit as much as we can about the reliability and confidence level of our work. And we get this maps. This shows the Horn of Africa, but we also are working in to varying degrees in 30 countries around the world, which I'll talk about in a bit. So ultimately, we expect to see even potentially a global map. We're slowly getting there. But I'll talk about our implementation process towards the end. I want to show one very clear-cut example of the power of using a common classification system. And this example shows a great success and a great failure, depending upon how you look at this. Chris, I have to acknowledge, is one of the people part and parcel of actually doing the analysis and whatnot. The group of people who were doing the analysis for Somalia were using the IPC. They were agreed. We're using the IPC standards. We know what standards we have to adhere to. And furthermore, I should mention for phase 5, if you're going to declare phase 5, I didn't mention this before, we've set the bar very high for the burden of evidence. In other words, you have to have not just one piece of evidence for the outcomes, you have to have 3. You have to have direct evidence of food consumption, malnutrition, and mortality. And if you don't have that meets our thresholds for phase 5, you don't get to classify famine. So we've set the bar very high. So the analysts doing this all knew what reference system they were using and the process and the burden of evidence that they would have to pull together, such that when they did declare famine on July 22nd, 2011, you see from this graph what happened in terms of pledges for financial assistance and reaching beneficiaries. An immediate uptick. Despite months and months, if not almost a whole year in advance, early warning signals that were coming out from FSAU and from Food Security Analysis Unit for Somalia and NGOs on the ground and others. Early warning signals were there, and the resistance was high for a plethora of reasons. And people are writing about this. In fact, Chris and I have been involved in a big effort in a journal called Global Food Security, which is reflecting on what happened on the Somalia response. And it has to do with normalization of crisis. It has to do with issues of humanitarian access in Somalia and many, many other things. But nonetheless, once that phase 5 was declared, the decision makers and decision makers in Nairobi and globally, the donors who know about the IPC, they know how the IPC works and the standards that it uses. There was no more bickering. Immediately, the amount of money that went into Somalia, the amount of people who were reached, was an immediate uptick. It was a real-time declaration of famine with an immediate response, which is exactly what we want to see. Except, we want to see that response much earlier. Much, much earlier. We don't want to wait till phase 5 for that to happen. Rather, we'd like to see, we demand to see decision makers responding at phase 3, 4, 5 as a progression of the situation gets more and more severe, and furthermore, to respond to early warning messages. So this is what we're working on now, is to improve from the analyst point of view our communication efforts, but also improve from the decision-making point of view their understanding of how to use these tools and how to respond in a more effective manner. Like I said, this is a good example of the community recognizing the value of a common classification, but it's also a bad example because we want them to act earlier. This is a big, rich discussion, but I'm going to flip slides. Inasmuch as we have so far with the IPC focused on acute food insecurity, because IPC was originally developed in the Somalia context and is large and has been used to classify crises throughout the Horn, in Southern Africa, in parts of Latin America, and Asia. Our emphasis with version 2 of the manual was to even become more clear that with IPC version 2, we're talking about classifying acute crises. And we've tightened up the whole package around acute. However, we have a strong demand from people in the field and from decision makers to tackle this notion of chronic. And they say, well, if you can classify acute, and you're making huge progress and huge strides in informing the right decisions for acute responses, can you now focus on chronic? And in fact, this is a very important challenge. Why? Because there are different broad typologies of food insecurity, and if we can't make this distinction, then we shouldn't be surprised if we don't actually end hunger. And again, you heard me say at the outset, it's a very different reality if you actually put on a perspective of, I want to end hunger. I want to end it, not just do things. So if you want to end it, you have to come to grips with a distinction between high chronic food insecurity and low acute food insecurity. Situations, there are countries that have high chronic, and at any given time they might have low acute. You could probably think in your head a number of these countries that fit that bill. Zimbabwe fits that bill right now. It's not to say that Zimbabwe's acute situation can't come very high if there's a drought or political violence or something like that. But as of right now, it's actually low acute, despite there's a lot of talk and conventional wisdom that there's this major food security crisis in Zimbabwe. But it's actually right now of chronic nature, not of acute nature, which has very different implications for strategic response. Acute, we should be focusing on decision-making with short-term strategic objectives. Chronic, decision-making with medium and longer-term strategic objectives. Things like building resilience, micronutrient fortification, safety nets, and things like that. Education. These take 1 to 5 years to come to fruition. Acute, any acute situation in the world, we can bring that acute severity down within a year with the right marshaling of resources. So my typology number 1 is a situation with high, chronic, and low acute. Typology number 2 is low chronic and high acute. We saw a very clear-cut example of that with the Japanese tsunami. You don't think of the Japanese people as being chronically food insecure. They're not. But when that tsunami hit, there were a group of Japanese people who suddenly became very acutely food insecure, such that they needed food aid. Now, granted, the Japanese government could handle that largely on its own, but nonetheless, the people were in acute situation for that period of time. Versus situations which are high acute and high chronic. So this would have been, these are places like Somalia, Ethiopia, parts of Sudan, when there's ongoing high chronic food insecurity and a major crisis happening at the same time. We have to recognize that there are two dynamics are happening simultaneously. In other words, if there's a major crisis going on, an acute crisis and a chronic situation, we should be working, our emergency efforts should be working not just to bring down the severity levels, but actually to address the chronic at the same time, or draw attention to it. Versus where we all want to be, keep our eye on the goal, and that is low acute, low chronic. Both of these, when they're low, we can finally, if we ever get there, say that people are food secure. Yes.
How does the IPC control for measuring, say, like phase 3 during the lean season versus, say, like right after harvest?
Okay, good question. So our definition of acute food insecurity is the severity of the situation irrespective of the causes, context, or duration. So acute can be at any time. So it's incumbent on the analysts to dip their thermometer in the water, so to speak, at the most severe time so that they're able to communicate how severe the situation is. For our chronic, and now I am going to talk a little bit about how our formulation of the chronic, whereas acute we say is the severity of the situation irregardless of causes, context, or duration. Chronic, our working definition right now, although this is subject to change, our working definition is the persistence of food insecurity even during a normal year. If you are food insecure, if your household is food insecure even during a, heavy quotes, normal year, no shock, you are chronically food insecure. There's something going on such that even under normal conditions, you aren't able to get by. Your question now becomes a very interesting question when it comes to classifying chronic. When do you measure? What is that normal year? There are also lean months out of that year. So we've created a typology. Not only is there a broad typology of food insecurity, we've created a typology of chronic food insecurity to detect households which are just ongoing unable to meet their food and nutrition needs versus households which during a normal year are able to meet their needs except for those 3 months out of the year which are lean months, versus households which are able to meet their needs, but over the last 10 years they've been subject to frequent shocks. That's our 3 typologies of chronic. And that basic typology of chronic, as banal as that sounds, becomes incredibly important for the type of programming you'll want to do. This is about making broad categorizations so that we can, and it's categorizations that ideally we as a community can all agree on, such that now we can work to do our programming within those broad categorizations. We are now developing, so inasmuch as the IPC version 2, excuse me 1 second. I'm not picking out my phone, by the way. So we've just released this. This is the IPC version 2 manual. And this manual's focus is on classifying acute food insecurity, and it represents consensus of all those partner agencies on how to do it. Our job isn't done, however. Our job isn't done because A, we recognize that we're going to be learning by doing. There will be further understandings and improvements on how to classify acute food insecurity, so there's likely to be a version 2.1 or version 3, and that's fine. But this is a good working model now. The second way our job isn't done is because we want to tackle chronic. In that manual, in the annex, we've introduced a prototype system for classifying chronic food insecurity. And we're now embarking on formulating a working group of partners to work on that pilot, a prototype, and also to pilot it in 5 countries, which will be Guatemala, most likely, this isn't set yet, but most likely Guatemala, Niger, Bangladesh, Kenya, and Zimbabwe. We're formulating a working group, a chronic working group, the global partners are, and in that working group will be a member of each one of our partner agencies, plus we are now reaching out beyond that initial partnership to other agencies which have more kind of developmental chronic perspectives, such as the World Bank. So one of my main reasons for being here today is actually to make an offer to the World Bank to identify a technical person to join this chronic working group with us and to be a part of this group of people. It'll be about 15 people who now will be piloting this in various countries, learning from those experiences and reconvening and pulling up our shirt sleeves and figuring out now how to come up with an agreed system for classifying chronic. So one outcome I would like to see from this discussion is to provoke a discussion amongst World Bank colleagues and say, can we get involved in this? And I can tell you with absolute certainty that the IPC steering committees would be delighted if someone from the World Bank could be a part of this, which would be very important, because I think the bank has a lot of experience in dealing with these longer-term developmental, longer-term food security issues. We'd like that experience in there. And furthermore, if we can agree on a common system, then the bank will own that system as well, such that it helps you inform your decision making. And now we're all using the same system. So national governments around the world we're all using the same system. And just to mention, we're also reaching out to IFPRI to be a part of that group and FANTA to be a part of that group. And if there are other likely candidates, we'd take suggestions as well. Our next steps, technical development. So our job's never done, technically. We consider ourselves trying to be at the cutting edge of thinking on classifying food insecurity. We are right now embarking on developing an information support system, an online information support system for people to do this in a digital environment, and furthermore in a collaborative workspace environment. So people could, you could be sitting here in Washington, D.C., working with Kenyans on the Kenya analysis in a collaborative workspace. Furthermore, it will usher in an era of more accountability and transparency when that data and everything is online. The second one is capacity building and certification. We have developed a set of training materials, and we are embarking now on certifying people and IPC certified on 2 levels. Level 1 is for analysts, and level 2 are for trainers. That's, if you recall, I mentioned about standards and whatnot. This addresses that issue. Not wholly, but partly. The other one is country support. We continue to provide technical support to countries. And lastly, institutionalization. We're actively involved in ensuring within the donor community and national governments that the IPC is part and parcel of how decisions are made. The first question people should ask when there's a crisis is, what does the IPC say? What's the IPC analysis say? We're implementing in almost 30 countries around the world so far, and we expect a significant uptick in this in the coming year. I'm going to end by showing you one of the very first maps, which was not called IPC, but this was a classification system from 1918 of Europe. So the idea of classifying is nothing new, obviously. That is nothing new. This classifies areas of under famine conditions or serious food shortage and whatnot. 2 things are different about this. Number 1, those categories, we've now put actual meanings to those categories. Objectively verifiable indicators are now associated to our categories, not just broad descriptions. Number 2, I put this map up here to remind us that even in the most dire food security situations, people can become food secure. There's no reason why, this was Europe 1918, a rather disaster. There's no reason why, and Europe now, you wouldn't expect to see this. There's no reason why anywhere in the world people can't be as food secure as people right here in Washington, D.C. Recognizing we have pockets and we still have big challenges here in Washington, D.C. as well. I don't mean to overlook that. But in general, we've made huge strides in food security for Western Europe. We can make huge strides in food security for the entire globe. And for more information, you can go on our website and get all kinds of information about where we work, how we work, and more information about our partners. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much for a very clear and very candid presentation of a very complex issue. Before I just give the word to the floor for questions and answers, let me tell you that I'm personally very excited at the idea of differentiating and distinguishing chronic and acute food insecurity. And I think our group here, Secure Nutrition, is the right place to have that discussion within the bank to identify that person. So I take note of the offer and we'll be in contact for sure.
Excellent.
So now question and answer, please. With a microphone, thank you.
You mentioned the working group on chronic. What is the quantitative way of distinguishing? Is it thresholds or an index, or how is that going to be classified? Because it implies that it's quantitative. And quantitative in what way?
Well, we have a prototype in our manual right now, which spells out our current thinking on that. Although I'll say right up front that after doing the country pilots and getting other ideas into it, we might crumple that up and start afresh. But what we have right now is we use our same analytical framework, same notion of focusing on the 4 outcomes, which allow us to have comparability. That's number 1. For each of food consumption, livelihood change, and nutrition, actually mortality we've taken out because mortality gets to too many other factors other than food to tease apart what explains the mortality rate. So we've actually just focused on the 3: food consumption, livelihood change, and malnutrition. A clear example there is whereas acute has GAM, global acute malnutrition, for our chronic we use stunting. That's a clear distinction. For our food consumption, whereas our acute looks at the severity of food consumption using any one of indicators like household dietary diversity score, so we can see how severe things get. The chronic says for a certain threshold of dietary diversity, how many households, what percentages of households are not able to cross that threshold even during a normal year. So it's the persistence of food insecurity, the percentages of households that persist to be food insecure even in a normal year. So we're still quantifying it that way. And then we triangulate with some other indicators now. On chronic, we bring in national poverty line. So we don't use the global poverty line, but we use a national poverty line and other indicators which help us determine whether or not the place is chronic. So it still attempts to be quantitative, but it's still using this convergence of evidence approach.
Just a follow-up. Small microphone. You said dietary diversification.
Dietary diversity score. So I just picked out one of the methodologies, household dietary diversity score. Okay. Other methodologies that we have are food consumption score, household economy approach, coping strategies index, and the household hunger score.
But so you distinguish between calories versus other foodstuffs that have lower calories but higher nutrient content?
The food consumption score in particular tries to make that distinction. Not all those methodologies, each one of those methodologies has slightly different comparative advantages. As a whole, between them, you are able to distinguish what is a nutritious quality issue versus a quantity issue. And we're doing it's more of a mashup. We're mashing up these indicators and then trying to label a place as being one of our 4 levels of chronic food insecurity: low, medium, high, and very high. You can take a look at our prototype if you'd like. And if you're really interested in this, we'd like you in our working group. Because this, in fact, is a very tough nut to crack.
Just 2 questions. One that I should have jumped in when we were talking about the frequency, but I'm just wondering if there's kind of included any guidelines in terms of frequency of how often you do the evaluation or the analysis. So for example, you were showing the graph and I didn't see between the early warnings how much time you waited and between the famine classification. So I'm just wondering if there's a standard related to that. Mm-hmm. And then second, if there's any flexibility, I haven't read the manual and I will take a look at it, but any flexibility in terms of the actual actions from each phase. So for example, based on the context. So even if you're in a famine, but the problem is more closely linked to conflict or violence than water availability or food availability, for example, what's the flexibility in terms of implementation within each phase? Mm-hmm. And if that's kind of tweaked to respond to the country context.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so number one, and I didn't mention this, the IPC acute analysis should be a living statement, meaning you should update your IPC analysis whenever you think the situation has or will change in the future. That can mean, and beyond that guidance, it's totally up to the analyst and the decision maker needs and the situation at hand. You could theoretically update your situation in a highly dynamic, like a tsunami or a civil insecurity type of situation. You might update every week. Seems kind of extreme, but you could theoretically update every week, or you might just update once a year. The IPC analysis, it's a living statement, so it's incumbent on the analyst. And this now identifies huge challenges for managing that working group, the technical working group of people doing it, having the tight management of them such that data gets in there and they're able to convene and do their analysis in a rapid manner. Organizations like FuseNet has this systematized very nicely so that you'll see FuseNet products come out every 3 months. It's regular basis, and they're updating their IPC analysis each time. In country, that will depend upon, like I said, a number of factors. My main point is it's meant to be a living statement, and it's incumbent on the analysis to update if they think the situation has changed. And if they're not doing their job, they should be fired. No, I'm serious. We're entering in an era of accountability, and without tools like this, we are not able to hold people accountable. And if you're not able to do the job, if your institution can't do the job, we need someone who can, because our goal is to end food insecurity. Your second question is how about responses? We've designed the IPC very strategically and with great sensitivity towards the issue of not prescribing solutions. Rather, the IPC stops at identifying strategic objectives for each phase, and our reference table identifies the strategic objectives for each phase, plus identifying the causes. We don't say what to do about it for the very reasons that you were kind of insinuating, and that is every different local context will require a different set of responses. And that nuance has to be totally open to that next stage. If your memory is really good, I had that diagram of the analysis response continuum. That next stage of response analysis is where you should get down and think about what we should do about this, given the severity and many other factors like logistics, cost-benefit operations, security, and whatnot.
I was going to ask a question about the table that you gave where you saw the peak after Somalia declaring famine and the response, right? The response by other governments. I'm wondering if you have other examples of this and if you've looked at the contextual factors that have helped determine contributions. So is this causal? Can you say definitively is this causal? Mm-hmm. And if you can't, is there anything that you're doing to help prove causality between a statement by IPC that famine is occurring and direct contributions from donor organizations?
Mm-hmm. Chris, do you want to comment? You have to do it in the microphone. And I'm going to ask Chris to comment, actually reflecting not just on this, because this one I think that there's a very clear relationship, but also Chris, in his role as decision support analyst for FuseNet, has a lot of experiences in seeing how the FuseNet analysis is picked up by decision makers.
And visually it's clear. I'm just questioning whether statistically it's clear.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You want to make a couple comments, Chris? You don't have to.
I guess the short answer is there's no statistical proof. But I would, if I was a gambling man, I would bet the house that that's what happened. Just from being around, being part of the decision to declare a famine and then being there and watching the decision-making processes that then happened, I think you could make an extremely compelling case that they were related.
What I'm trying to get at too is the factors that might also be related to this, right? So is it just the declaration of IPC, or are there other things that we should be concerned about to make sure that there's recognition of an announcement of a particular phase? So once you declare famine by the IPC, were there other things that were going on that helped boost aid that weren't happening at these other phases, right? So is it possible to ask whether the reason that the response was not equivalent in the early phases with early warning and seasonal rainfall that did happen at the declaration of famine? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I think I do. I guess the comment to make is that because I think you could argue that the reason you saw such an explosion after the famine declaration is because the response until that point had been so bad. And so the level of emergency assistance that was going into Somalia was so low that when that famine declaration sort of provided a tipping point at which then sort of, you threw everything in the kitchen sink at the famine. If response implementation and analysis had been occurring when these earlier warnings happened, I don't think you would have seen this kind of, things would have built up more gradually. So I think the sudden decision to respond once things got to a very extreme level is part of the reason that it's such a distinct change.
In my professional career, I've seen those people who focus on acute and those people who focus on chronic. Mm-hmm. And part of the gap is making sure that those who come through with acute responses, that there's not a fall off and a break between those who work on chronic. Your classification system seems to allow, as your clear graphs have shown, a way for this to be explained visually and in terms of definitions. Have you thought more about how your classification system might help bridge the development continuum from emergency response through longer-term development assistance?
Mm-hmm. This is indeed a big challenge we all recognize. One benefit, if we're successful in having an agreed upon system for classifying chronic, is rather than having acute, well, let me state it as a positive. We would then be in a situation to keep our eye on what the chronic situation is and consider acute to be an aberration of that. So we always should be working with what the chronic situation is, what the developmental context is for a situation, and consider emergencies to be an aberration of our efforts on development. And then so when the emergency happens, A, we respond in a way which is supportive of the efforts, the developmental efforts, and B, when the emergency comes down, we're back to working just on our developmental efforts. So keep our eye on the developmental efforts. Whereas right now it's kind of flipped the other way. We tend to pay attention to food insecurity when there's a crisis. And then exactly what you say, when the crisis goes away, we tend to forget that there is a crisis. So think Ethiopia, think northern Kenya, and think many places in the world. So I think what will happen, if we're successful here, is the agreed upon chronic classification will be our starting point to have multiple developmental actors, governments, the bank, the NGO, UN community, all working on the chronic situation. And then when the emergency happens, we consider an aberration. We respond to the emergency in a way that supports our efforts on dealing with chronic. And when the emergency goes down, we're back to working on chronic.
Technocratically, that is a perfect solution. Academically, that's a perfect solution. But Washington, Geneva, elsewhere in New York, in this world, and much of the NGO community focuses on and gets their money because they respond to crying babies and starving mothers. Mm-hmm. So somehow we need to move toward that academically and technocratically perfect solution. But there's a huge, as you mentioned, your third stage is communication, and then quality assurance. It's that KM, that's that third stage of communication of this message, wherein Congress, the NGOs can develop their resource base based not on the starving mothers. And I don't have the answer to that, but I think we need to somehow get to where you've described, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, I hear you. I hear you loud and clear. One thing we have done on our map in terms of communication, I didn't show you the details of what we call our communication template, is we've now enabled the possibility of when you classify an acute situation for that same area, you signify what the chronic condition is. Ideally, a decision maker would look at that and say, I see this area is only phase 2, but chronic level high 4. and respond in that way. So now that way the acute maps will open the door to discuss the chronic. But what you're describing there is very real, very, very real. It has everything to do with institutions, has to do with human nature, has to do with risk aversion, has to do with politics and many, many other things. But at least with the IPC, we're trying to shine the light on and make sense of things.
Hi, Nick.
Hi.
Having been privy to your 2004 efforts on IPC in Somalia, Brian Bacon.
Oh, Brian, how you doing?
And what's happened in the interim 8 years. Congratulations on
Thank you.
Getting it this far.
Thank you very much.
In a similar regard, with regard to institutionalization of the IPC, and coming from a donor agency, what continue to be your challenges in promulgating, standardizing this as a standard across not just the humanitarian set of stakeholders and donors and related government agencies, but more broadly in a development context?
Great question. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about that. One is institutional commitment to use the IPC. I can't wait for the day, and maybe the day's even already happened. I just wasn't in the closed room door where it actually happened. I can't wait for the day when a group of donors hear an appeal for assistance in a country, $10 million, $100 million, and the first thing they say, well, where's the IPC analysis on this? We're not going to act until we see the consensus-based, evidence-based analysis that says the situation is really X. I know DFID is very, very close, and I'm going there in a week and a half, very, very close to institutionalizing that as part of their decision-making process, that they won't give funds for a food security emergency-based response. They're not there yet, let me not speak, but I know they're considering it, that they won't give funds unless there's actual IPC analysis. So the whole system ideally would institutionalize this way of thinking, evidence-based decision support. And in this case right now, for the food security, we have the IPC. So that's one. Two is capacity building and technical support for national governments. As we say, we put the national governments front and center in these technical working groups. We've set it up so that the national governments are the chair people of the technical working groups and the international community supports. That requires resources. We are on an ambitious effort right now as a global support unit to train and do capacity building, but even our resources are pretty limited. So we have some very generous donations from different donors, but we need more. We need more to be able to direct that money to governments to A, do training and capacity building, and B, to help. It's not even a lot of money, by the way. Each round of analysis in a country like Uganda or Kenya costs only about $25,000. And all that's paying for is to get people together. A little bit of travel and money for them to get together, to share, to bring their data and co-locate to do the analysis. So it's money to do trainings, money to do analysis. We have some, we need more, and there needs to be a longer-term commitment around that. So I would say greater institutionalization. And that means institutionalization, I'm trying to think from your shoes there, from institutionalization within USAID, but also advocating for the use of the IPC with your colleagues and peers who are dealing with operating at the same level. And then secondly, yes, their money is required for capacity building and technical support in countries, but it's not that much money. It's just that when you look at a global scale, it turns into a larger figure.
I think the discussion so far is about international organization, donors. I want to think about also the government point of view, the domestic point of view.
Yeah.
And obviously this is very important, and this is probably clearly understood by those domestic counterparts in your working group. But sometimes, more than sometimes, typically politicians may not really care so much about the concept of food insecurity as much as, for instance, food self-dependency. How the IPC has been so far successful in educating locally and changing these biases.
Because our analytical framework is so clear about what it means to be food secure. And we say food secure isn't necessarily being food self-dependent, self-sufficient. Thank you. Because markets are very important. You don't think of Dubai as being food insecure because they don't grow their own food, but they import it. The more we get out there and we're able to train people on this framework, the more we're able to communicate that message. But there's a broader point, if I can touch on, and that is, to put it bluntly, how well received is IPC by national governments? And one could think of that as being IPC being a very threatening thing or a very positive thing. Largely, and I'll say 9 times out of 10, excepting for the most extreme kind of government, which is an autocratic maybe type government, they really appreciate the IPC approach for 2 reasons. One, we set it up so that they're leading the process. So suddenly what used to be, and I don't mean to pick on them, it's only because they've been so incredibly successful, what used to maybe be a WFP-led process to determine how many people in country X need food assistance, and really it was WFP would make the decisions, and the government would passively say, yeah, thank you very much. And I don't mean to pick on them, it's just because they've been so successful. Now it's the national governments leading the process and WFP supporting it, which is where we want to get. So we've had positive reception because it puts them in charge as they should be. Secondly, it opens up this black box of food security analysis. If any of you are familiar with the commonly used methodologies like household economy approach and other methodologies that are used to determine how many people are food insecure, these are opaque. They're very opaque, and oftentimes you don't know how and why people came to conclusions of X number of people needing food assistance. And I'm guilty party number 1. Before I was doing IPC analysis, I was one of the guys who would go into the room, mess with the data with Owen, go in the room, mess with the data, and come out and announce X number of people need assistance. Black box. You don't know really what went into that. You hope and cross your fingers that the people who did that actually did it responsibly. With the IPC, it's a completely open box. Governments understand the process. They can see the evidence. You can involve them in the discussions. So they own it and they understand it. There are funny examples of this. In 2005, 2006, we were doing IPC analysis in Khartoum. This was after the peak of Darfur. Just after the peak, so finally people were responding and mortality rates and malnutrition rates were starting to come down. But nonetheless, it was still a severe situation. How severe? Nobody knew. Because President Bashir was saying there was no crisis in Darfur whatsoever. And some in the NGO community are saying this is the biggest famine in history going on right now. So we did IPC analysis. Government officials, technical people from the Bashir government were there present, with NGO technical people, with UN technical people. By the way, it was the first time they actually sat down together to talk about the situation in Darfur, literally. Used our evidence-based approach, used our analysis template, and we all agreed that Darfur was phase 4 at that time. Granted, it was past the peak, but it was phase 4. But there was agreement and consensus. So the governments tend to appreciate the fact that now we're allowing them to lead the process, and we've opened up the box so they can understand what goes into it.
I'm Tom Schetzel from the Manoff Group. I have a couple of questions. The first one is about gender, and if there's any place in this system where you're taking into account the gender differentials in both the perception and the experience of food insecurity, rather than treating the entire population, as the same. The second one relates a little bit to what you were just talking about. You talked about putting the bar high for this phase 5. But on the one hand, you would think that why wait till people are dropping everywhere if you're going to get the response? Why not call it earlier? I think I might know why, but if you could talk to it a bit, I'd appreciate it. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Okay, gender is in the IPC in several places. At the very outset, in what we call this National Technical Working Group, this is the group of people who should get together and do the IPC analysis. I didn't describe this group very much, but I'll just take a second to describe it to you. A, that group should be led by a government person. B, the composition of that group should be devised according to two dimensions. Dimension number one is institutional affiliation. And we have a matrix to help guide this formation. People from the government, from UN, NGOs, technical agencies. Dimension number two is sectoral expertise. In that, we explicitly say gender expertise. So in your technical working group, sitting alongside your statistician, your markets person, your crop production person, your livestock person, etc., should be a gender analyst. Part and parcel. That's number one. So that way they make sure you get that analysis in there. Number two, whenever you document your evidence and analyze your evidence for the area and the household group, you're instructed in the manual to tease out those gender differences. Third, on a tool that we call the limiting factors matrix, which is a tool that we've developed to draw attention to the immediate causes of food insecurity along the lines of what's limiting people with regards to availability, access, and utilization, you're meant to tease out the gender differences there as well. So it's in those three places. Now what we don't do, and this is maybe a legitimate critique, maybe not, is we don't insist that you present the numbers by gender. This may be something in the future that we can do it. We don't keep people from doing it. You're welcome to do it, but we don't insist that you do it. So that might be something in the future. And your second question, remind me very quickly. Oh yeah, the early warning bit. Chris, feel free to jump in. Chris is pulling his hair. He still has hair, amazingly to think. He's pulling his hair out, trying to think about how we can improve on our early warning messages and link it to a successful response. Absolutely, we do not want people to wait till phase 5. And I put that graph up there, and I said very clearly, you can look at that positively, that there was this uptick of response immediately following the declaration, but it's actually represents a failure. We shouldn't have waited that long. And that's an issue of, that's a number of issues. And I'll just look from the analyst point of view, that we can improve the way we do our job, is to be more clear about our early warning projections earlier on, take risks about our projections, and to more actively, I know tremendous effort goes into this, but even more actively engage in communicating that with decision makers. Sit down with them, go have coffee with them, have dinner with them if you have to. Sit in the meetings and be a part of the discussions because communication, as you know, can be passive or active. Passive communication, you put something up on your website. Well, congratulations. Active communication is you put it on your website and then you go and participate in meetings. So I think there's huge space for us to improve the way we do things, but then there's this whole set of other issues that are unique to Somalia that one could use as justification for the late response, rightly or wrongly. And there are another set of issues with the humanitarian architecture and taking risks, big donors taking risks with money, because that's basically what it comes down to. Yeah, does that answer your question? There's a suite of issues that fit into that.
Final burning question, if anyone? No? Thank you very much, Dr. Haan. It was a very fascinating presentation, and everyone for your attention and participation. Thank you very much.
And Jose, I'll leave this on the computer. You're welcome to send it around. No problem. Well, Brian, how you doing? You look a bit familiar.
Yeah. 8 years is a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah, you good?
Yeah.
Still talking about the IPC. And others. Good to see. So I saw Karine. She came through here for the World AIDS Conference. And that's good. Hey, we'd love to meet you.
I'm leaving tonight. My role now
yeah. Maybe different houses. I got your.
terrible.
What kind of salesman are you?
I'm a terrible salesman. Not a self-salesman. An idea salesman.
Are you?
Yeah.
Okay. Just. Then we can take this up already.
Do you have anything already scheduled?
We're going to come back here and make check in February.
Yeah, so if you would like to okay, same question. You know, I did the symposium. Did you do that?
That's exactly what
Sure. I'm actually one of the lucky people in the State Department responsible for reducing uncertainty in that workforce.
That's an easy job. Why you complain? That's an easy job.
That's good.
Thank you very much.
If North Korea ever comes up to those things, or you ever come across anything that would be of interest.
I'm going to go there too.
Okay, very good. Here's mine. So, yeah, like I say, if you're coming back to Washington, you should come to the State Department as well.
Great.
Okay, good seeing you again.
Nice to see you as well.
Hi, Leslie. You're welcome. Yeah.
Really well.
Good.
Should we try to haul any of the food back or not?
What's that?
Should we haul any of the food back or not? Oh, there's so much food.
Yeah.
Should we haul it back? You know, like
Oh, the food.
trays,
Yeah.
or just leave it? What do you
Up
think?
to you.
Is anybody there to eat it?
There's hardly anybody at the office. I mean, I can see. I'm on my bike, so let me know.
Oh yeah, no. My sense is we would that maybe we can. Yeah. Anyway.
I can try to maybe take it and then come back for the bike.
Oh well, we can.
Are you guys heading back that way?
We're all heading back, I think, or I'm heading back anyway. So we can take some. We want to.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.